What's up everybody, it's Rob from the Basement Bike Shop, and today we're going to go over the removal and installation of mid-bottom brackets without a cup press or bearing press. So before we get started, I flipped the bike upside down and propped up the seat, and then I put on hard shell knee pads. If you've watched my crank videos or any of my other videos, you've seen me do this. So to get started, I'm going to use my ratchet extension to move the center tube spacer so that I can hit on the edge of the bearing. And then as I do this, I want to tap a little on the top, a little on the bottom, and alternate back and forth so that the bearing comes out straight. It's the best way to do it to minimize the amount of damage that you're doing to the bearing. And we'll talk more about that when we look at the other side and I can show you what the inside of the bearing looks like. If I'm able, I try not to use the same bottom bracket twice, especially if I feel like it's been compromised in the removal. So even when I switch the crank to another bike, I'll put a new bottom bracket in that bike, especially if I really need it to run smoothly. So once you have the one side out and you flip it around, you take your center tube spacer out and you can see the bearing. Now, just like the outside, there's a black ring that is just a dust cap to protect the bearings on the inside. You want to make sure you're not hitting on that. You want to put pressure on the outside ring, even the inside ring, but a lot of times that might kink the bearing too. The main thing is just distributing the pressure. You can see I went from the top to the sides to the bottom and back to the top until the bearing popped out. And that's about it for the removal. Now to the installation. The first thing you need to do is size your center tube spacer, especially if this crank has never been on this bike before. The ridge on each side where the bearing sits against should be the same length as the center tube spacer. Now obviously we took this one out of this bike, so it is the exact same size. But on our Mafia frame we did earlier, we actually had to cut our center spacer. And I'm going to show you how we did that. After we got the measurement from the left race to the right race, we then marked the center tube spacer. And then if you have to cut it, I try to cut it a little bit long. I can always file it down to get it perfect. After I marked it all the way around, I cut it a little bit from each side, a little bit from the top, and then I spun it and then cut it a little bit more. And did that just so that I didn't cut from one side to the other and cut at an angle. After that, you can take a file and file down all the rough edges. File it down to the correct length. Take any burrs off of the outside and especially the inside. This has to slide over your spindle smoothly. So make sure you get any ridges off. I've done it with a pipe cutter already, like I cut my handlebars, but then you just have to do more filing on the inside. After you get it cut, it's a good idea to slide it onto the spindle that you're going to be installing, just to make sure before you install the bottom bracket that everything's going to fit correctly. As long as you know it's going to slide on the spindle, then we're good to go. Now, if you have access to a bench vise, then I recommend you watching my bench vise installation video. It's a real easy way and my favorite way to install bottom brackets. I'd actually rather use that than a cup press. But if you don't have one, the way I do it is with my bike upside down, propped up, and my knee pads on. I clean the bearing race on the frame. And as long as there's not an excessive amount of paint, I just grease it up a little bit, Some people will actually file it down if it's a new frame with a lot of paint. I have never had to do that. I'm going to take the bearing and just tap it with a hammer so that it sits without me having to hold it. Then I'll take my block of wood, put my knees against the frame, and then just hit the block of wood against the bearing. I do this because the knee pads and my knees will give just a little bit, so I'm not putting too much pressure on the bearing or the frame. Now I realize I could use my rod brace from my 3-piece crank installation video, but I've never had to put that much pressure on the bottom bracket like I did the 3-piece crank, so I never used it for that. But I suppose you could if you didn't have knee pads or had bad knees, or your bottom bracket was just being very stubborn. So on the other side, we're going to apply a little grease to the bearing race. Don't forget to put your center tube spacer in at this time. I've already put the whole bottom bracket in, and then put the whole 3-piece crank in, and then realized I forgot the center tube spacer and had to take it all apart. And just like the other side, we're just going to tap the bearing till it sits in there without us having to hold it, and then take our block of wood. Now keep an eye on how the bearing is going in case you need to hit more on the bottom or the top to get it to go in straight. Then after you get the bottom bracket in, I stick my ratchet extension in there and move the center tube spacer to the center of the bearing hole. And that wraps up this video. Thanks for watching. If you like what I'm doing here, go ahead and give me a like and hit that subscribe button, and I'll keep these videos coming. I try to do a video every week, so if you want to stay on top, you can turn those alerts on and then you won't miss it. Thanks.